Hi, Dr. Robert Hathaway, is it?
Hardaway, Robert Hardaway,
Hardaway. Well, I'm so grateful
professor
to
of
have
law at the University of Denver,
uh,
Sturm College.
I'm so grateful to have you here today, Professor. You're going to talk about a subject we've never covered on Savvy, and that's the Electoral College. There's been a lot of controversy, especially the past couple of years, about some folks saying, hey, it's not fair, it should be one vote, one person, and this electoral college is just something slave traders wanted so that they could get more of a vote. And you're an expert on this. You're a professor and you actually teach on this very subject and law and the electoral college, and so you'll be able to enlighten us. Should it be done away with? Is it a good idea? But before we go to that, share a little bit about your background so people understand where you came from.
Well, yes, I've been specializing in the law of the Electoral College for many years. I teach election law here at the University of Denver, and so it's been a topic which has been my main area of research for many years. And I think a lot of us have forgotten what we learned in sixth grade in sixth grade civics class
Yeah.
about the creation of the United States of America. Um, when George Washington was asked to monitor or to preside at the Constitutional Convention, he said, "There's no way that we're going to get a compromise that will bring all of the colonies together,
Mm.
because the big states said that if we're going to have a national government, it should be based purely on population. That is, in a Congress,
Mm.
that only it should be based on population. The small states, which under the Articles of Confederation said we're not going to participate in any such nation unless we have equal representation in a Congress. That is, every state would have equal representation." And the Constitutional Convention was on the verge of breaking apart because even George Washington said, I should never have gotten involved in this. It's hopeless. And everyone
Mm.
was basically walking home from the Constitutional Convention saying, we're going to break up into 4 or 5 different countries. Pennsylvania and Virginia had decided to form their own amalgamation. And King George III was gloating that the Americans are never going to get together. They'll break together. They'll break apart into different countries like in South America. And it was only really in the last days of the convention that Benjamin Franklin created the United States of America with what we now call the Grand Compromise. He said the large states want to have representation in Congress based purely on population. The small states said we're not going to participate in any such nation and have Pennsylvania, Virginia, and so forth rule the roost. We demand equal representation. And George and Benjamin Franklin said, why don't we do both?
Mm.
Why don't we have 2 houses, one based on population and one based on equal representation of each state in the national legislature? This sort of this conspiracy theory that somehow it was all based on slaveholders and so
Mm.
forth. There was a separate compromise, had nothing to do with the Electoral College, of course, um,
Mhm.
with the southern states, because of the southern states wanted their representation in Congress to be based on the number of slaves they had. And of course, the North said, why should you get credit for the population of slaves when they aren't even allowed to vote? And so that was a separate compromise known as the 3/5 compromise. The North didn't think that the South should have any representation based on slaves. The South said, well, then fine, we won't join your union. We're going to form a separate country.
Mhm.
And the only way to get them in was to have this 3/5 compromise. Okay, you can count 3/5 of the slaves, but that has
Mhm.
nothing to do with the
The electoral
Electoral
college.
College, the grand compromise that created the United States of America.
Now, explain to me the 3/5. We're not using that at all right now, right? That's not part of what we do at all. The
Well, no,
3/5.
because after
Mm.
the 15th Amendment, there is no slavery, so
Mm.
that's a moot
Mm.
compromise. No, the South said we should have representation
Mhm.
in Congress based on including the population of our slaves, and
Mhm.
the North said that's crazy. We're not going to allow you to, and so that was the South said, fine, we'll form our own country, go on your
Yeah.
own way. So that was the compromise that brought the South into the Union.
Yeah, I love that you say that, but what we're defining here for people listening in is that was done away with once slavery was done away with,
Oh, it has
and we
nothing to do with it now.
yeah,
Nothing to do
yeah.
with it.
Yeah.
Once
So I
there was
love that we bring that up because people still, and I like I told you just before we got started, my professor in college was using just that point that the Electoral College is that 3/5, that it was inside of it, and hence we should do away with the Electoral College because that's nonsense. We don't have slavery, so we don't need the Electoral College.
There's
Now,
nothing to
yeah.
do. Benjamin Franklin's compromise had nothing to do with slavery. It was the
Mm,
big states, and Virginia, which was a slave state, was one of the bigger ones. So that was a
mm,
completely separate compromise called
mm,
the Grand Compromise.
yeah.
And the small states were even after the compromise was offered, they say, well, how do we know that as soon as we enter a grand union, how do we
Mm,
know you're not going to take away our right to equal representation in the Senate? And so that's why the last sentence of Article 5 guarantees to the small states that their representation based on equal representation in a Senate can
mhm,
never be taken away unless every state agrees. It's the only provision in the entire Constitution
mhm,
which you use which in which you have to have unanimity. Every state has to agree to that. So
mhm.
you can't really abolish the Electoral College,
No.
which is based on you get two electoral votes based on equal representation in the Senate.
Mm,
You can't do that unless every state agrees. So it's really a moot point about abolishing the Electoral College. That's simply not
mhm,
going to happen because
mhm,
Wyoming is not going to agree to
mhm.
give up its equal weight in the
Yeah.
Congress. They're simply not going to do it. And it's interesting because the New York Times recognized the
Mhm,
origins of the United States of America, and they in one of their most important
mhm.
editorials set forth why we have an electoral college. And let's read it to you, just a short
Sure.
paragraph. But it was the editors of the New York Times, not known as a conservative or right-wing
Mhm,
publication. It says the nation's founders sought in various ways to create checks and balances both inside and outside government. The Electoral College was first and foremost a compact among states, large and small, designed to ensure that one state or one region did not dominate the others.
mm,
It is one of the safeguards of a balanced federalism, much like the allocation of 2 senators to each state, regardless of size. And by offering the promise that even the smallest states could tip the balance in close elections, this system made it impossible to ignore them. This, in turn, required presidential candidates to build alliances across ideological and geographical lines.
mhm,
And so that was the New York Times. Now, yes, in recent years, people were upset
mm,
that Bush and later uh, Trump was
mhm.
elected president in the Electoral College, and so their reaction was very simplistic. Well, if it elected Bush, there must be something wrong with our whole national system. There
Mhm.
must be something wrong with the Grand Compromise. There must be something wrong with what
Yeah.
created the United States of America in the first place. And
Mhm.
that was the same argument used by the delegates to the convention who couldn't agree and were about to break up into 5 or 6 different countries. It's the same
Mhm.
argument. It's been
Yeah.
going on for 200 years, and fine. We'd be like South America now if this compromise had not been reached.
But, it's interesting to me, Professor, because I don't, it's either side could argue because it changes. What I've seemed to note is a kind of generally in the country, we'll elect a Republican for 2 terms usually. Then we'll go back to a Democrat for 2 terms usually, and then it's kind of a back and forth thing. So either side that's angry, it's like, well, your side's going to be in power in very short order because it does change hands. It seems pretty regularly in this
Well,
country.
yes, and anyone who loses in the Electoral College says, "Oh, there must be something wrong with the
Mhm,
whole system." But
mhm,
it's very rare because it's happened twice in the last 2 years that I
mhm,
suppose that our theoretical popular vote
mhm,
differed from the electoral vote.
mhm,
However, that only really happened once back in the 1880s. It's ever
mhm,
happened before, and
mhm.
it's based on an illusion that there's such a thing now as a popular vote, and
Yeah.
this illusion is created by the press. But there is
Ah,
no popular vote. People say, "Oh,
yeah.
but Bush lost the popular vote." People still to this day, and I've talked
Mhm,
to people, go into the voting booth and if you ask them, who'd you vote for? And they say, oh, Bush or Trump or whoever.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
say, oh, I voted for that person. You did not. You do it just like they do in England in the parliament. You vote for electors, and they have an electoral college in England. They call it a parliament, but it works in exactly the same way. You vote for representatives who then go into in London. In England, it's the parliament. In this country, it's the electoral college, and they vote for the candidate. So whenever people say, "Oh, some candidate won the popular," there is no popular vote. You don't, and that's because electors are not required to even vote for a particular candidate. In the 2016 election, several electors who were elected by the people of Colorado, because based on their promise that they would vote for Hillary Clinton, decided we don't want to vote for Hillary Clinton. We want to vote for a Republican.
Wow.
And that case, the state of Colorado said, but you have to vote for Hillary Clinton. And whether or not they can force electors to do that went to the U.S. Supreme Court. I filed the only amicus brief that was mentioned in oral argument. And by a vote of 9-0, the U.S. Supreme Court said states have the power to require electors to vote for the candidate that they promised to vote for. But half the states don't have that requirement. Half the states, the electors can vote for whomever they want, just like in England.
Wow.
And sometimes the theoretical popular vote, there is no such thing, of course, but newspapers love to create that illusion, differs from the electoral vote. And, if we had had a so-called popular vote election, we would have, that's the Russian system. The Russian system is that you don't have electoral college. Just you vote for a bunch of candidates, and then you have a runoff, supposedly, between the two top vote getters. So if the Communist Party gets 16% and the right-wing party gets 15%, then the voters are presented with a choice of between the communist, a hard communist, or a hard right-winger. And that means that someone gets elected, even though they're opposed by 2/3 of the electorate. Now, that's what happened in France in 2017. They have a supposed popular vote system, and they had 7 or 8 or 9 candidates. And one candidate was the right winger who got 23%, Le Pen. And then there was a Macron who managed to get, I don't know, I think about 20-some%, edging out the two major parties, so that the voters were now faced, because they don't have an electoral college. In 2017, the French voters had to choose between two candidates that the 2/3 of the electorate didn't want to have anything to do with. And they expressed their outrage for what passed as democracy by casting millions of blank ballots. That's how disgusted they were with this so-called popular vote system.
Wow. So, what's interesting, this is what happened a number of years ago. Trump had just been elected, and there was outrage on Facebook and all the social media. But one gal was like, we should be done way. We should have the popular vote should be the only thing that exists, and one vote, one person. Then all of our voices will be heard, and there'll be none of this nonsense of electoral college and the electorates. And that was her.
If they really believe that. And once it's explained to them, they wouldn't. They don't. Once they realize that the system that they want is the Russian system, is the French system, which produces a candidate that 2/3 of the popular of the people don't want. Once they understand that, they wouldn't propose what they're proposing. But if they did, that's the same argument for getting rid of the U.S. Senate. Because under the Senate, each state gets two senators. And so Wyoming gets the same number of senators as California. And people say, well, that's not fair. That's not fair. There should be a popular vote, in which case we could get rid of Wyoming. The people live out there would have no representation basically at all. And they would get maybe California would get 58 members of Congress, and Wyoming would be lucky to get 1. But that's not federalism. That's not what the New York Times pointed out is the basis of our national federal institutions which created the United States of America.
Yeah. And what they're forgetting is we have three branches just in that for that reason of checks and balances. Get rid of the Senate, but we have Congress as well that has representation
You know,
for
they
the
say
states.
that, and it's a nice political thing to say. Let's get rid of the U.S. Senate. It should be one person, one vote. We
Yeah.
want the Russian system. But you know that the small states were smart. They said, we're not going to join your union unless you guarantee to us that you will never, ever, even by constitutional amendment, which only requires 3/5 of the states, 2/3 of Congress, and so forth, unless you guarantee to us that we will never lose our equal representation in a Senate. And there has to be unanimity. And politicians won't tell the left wingers aren't going to tell their constituents, well, you can talk about getting rid of the Senate and the Electoral College, because remember, the Electoral College is based on the Senate. It's based on the representation in the Senate. So they're when people say get rid of the Electoral College, they don't realize it, but they're basically saying we need to get rid of the Senate. And some of them are honest about that. They say, yeah, let's get rid of the Senate. And some politicians have said, yeah, let's get rid of the Senate. But they can't unless every state agrees. You're going to have to get Wyoming and Alaska and all the small states to say, you don't get any representation anymore of any consequence. No one's going to pay attention to you in the election. It'll all be based on popular votes, and we can just basically run the country from the coast, California.
Yeah, from the coast in New York,
and that was precisely the fear of all those smaller states that said, we're not going to join your union. We'll form our own country. And they threatened to. They threatened to go back to England and say, if they're not going to give us our due and our rights, then we'll go back with England.
Wow. And so this is something, we're at a really interesting time in this country and the world. It's really upside down in lots of parts of the world with the pandemic that happened. But where do you see the country going? There is a lot of clash between, like you say, the coastal regions and the inner part of the United States that feels very differently, a different point of view of how the country should be run and where we should go. Where do you see with? Yeah,
that's precisely why we have an electoral college, so that we still can stay together as one country. That was the whole purpose of the electoral college, to make sure that not only is power concentrated in certain, say, big cities, but is spread out over the whole country. The concern of our constitutional framers was that support for a president should be broad, not just narrow. For example, let's say that during the 1950s, the South had overwhelming support for a segregationist candidate. And so they got 90%, let's say they had 90% support for segregation in the South. The South, with that overwhelming popular vote with 90%, could actually dictate to the rest of the country that didn't want segregation, that wanted equal rights.
Yeah.
And, that's the very reason that Black civil rights leaders testified in Congress against getting rid of the Electoral College, because they said, if you could eliminate the Electoral College, then you're diluting the Black vote. Black voters, say in New York, that can tip 45 electoral votes in favor of a Black candidate, their votes are going to be diluted and as just 10% of the electorate. And so that's why so many Black civil rights leaders were so against abolishing the Electoral College, and now is not the time, I would suggest. Now is not a good time to talk about diluting Black votes. I find that whole premise absolutely outrageous.
Yeah. And what is your promise to some in the country on either side thinking, well, maybe we should go our separate ways? I mean, that is a very sad idea to me. Do you see any of that as a possibility that states could decide to separate?
That's actually what happened in South America. There were leaders in South America that wanted to create a united South America, but they didn't have the vision that our constitutional framers did. So those countries went their own separate ways. It was only because of Benjamin Franklin's, I think, the greatest contribution he made to the United States, to the creation of the United States. And it's the only reason that we have one country. And the Electoral College binds the country together because it gives every region of
A
the
voice.
country, a voice.
Mm-hmm.
And that was recognized by the New York Times when they said the Electoral College is key to keeping our country together. If it weren't for the Electoral College, then I think, yes, we probably would be breaking apart, as it kind of happens in Russia, where power is concentrated, say in Moscow, or centralized. And that if it weren't for the Electoral College, I would be very pessimistic about the country remaining together. We would probably break apart, as would have happened back in 1789.
Well, I'm so grateful we didn't. And I'm so grateful that you were able to come out and really share your wisdom on this, enlighten people so that they're feeling that, okay, you are having a voice. We are having a voice as a country. And we're the luckiest people in the world because we're the only country that has this, the Electoral College. Professor Robert Hardaway, where can people find out more about you? Maybe if they're in your area, study with you.
I've written quite a few books on this subject. If anyone is really interested in the history of the Electoral College and why we have it, this book here, Saving the Electoral College, Why the National Popular Vote Would Undermine Democracy. And there's still people out there that don't understand it, that want the Russian system, that want a system that elects a candidate opposed by 2/3 of the electorate. People still they still like that whole idea.
Yeah.
And so they can get that from Amazon. They can get it from bookstores and so forth. Saving the Electoral College. So I hope that people can be educated, because they may have learned about what created the United States of America to protect. I think the most important thing was protecting. It worked out this way. It really does protect minority rights, as civil rights leaders have said in Congress. It's trying to save the Electoral College. But the person who saved the Electoral College from attack by Republicans, because Republicans back in 1956 were proposing to get rid of the Electoral College, and it was actually John F. Kennedy who came in and saved it. He pointed out to his Republican colleagues exactly what I've been saying. If you try to eliminate, first of all, you can't unless every state agrees. So that's not going to happen. But even your attempt undermines our whole federal system. And he's the one who gave the famous speech in Congress, in the Senate in 1956. This was before he became president, of course, in which he said, the Electoral College is what created the United States of America, and it is an absolute necessity to keep our country together. And what it does is it forces compromise before an election, because in 1932 and 1936, for example, the socialists were polling something like 14%. And the Democrats had to realize they needed that 14%. And so they made compromises with the socialists in order to win the election in the Electoral College. But if we do it like they do in England with a parliament, the problem is that you have to compromise after the election. You form these very, very unstable coalitions that break apart. In Italy, they have that kind of system. And they had something like 12 governments in 4 years. And we don't realize that our economic prosperity depends upon some stability. And these fragile coalitions, because if you don't have an Electoral College, you have to compromise after the election. And it's really not the time to do it. You need to compromise before the election. That's the beauty of the Electoral
And that's another very good point there that we never think about. All the rest of the European countries haven't been as prosperous as the U.S. And it's not just because we went out there and had great ideas and built stuff. Yeah, that's part of it. But as you just mentioned, it's the stability of our federal government that's allowed us to flourish. And that's not happened in a good part of the
That's why the United States is an economic a powerhouse because of that. When I give speeches to students around the country, I point out that if I was asked to give a speech, what are the two most, if you could pick two provisions of the United States Constitution to preserve, what would they be? And I said, there's two, most important. One is the Interstate Commerce Clause, because that way every state can produce what it's most efficient at producing. You trade, that increases your economic output enormously. But you couldn't have a Interstate Commerce Clause if you didn't have a united political nation that was stable. And not like in Italy, where you get 12 different governments in 3 years. So it is an amazing institution. It protects the rights of minority groups, which is why minority leaders who understand the Electoral College realize that they don't want their votes diluted.
Yeah. Yeah. And so I hope that just really gets people thinking, going out and getting your book and realizing that we want everyone to have a voice. And that was the whole point of it. I really thank you, Professor Hardaway, for coming today to Savvy to share your great wisdom on forbidden speech. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for getting me the word out. I could care less about the book. If I get any revenues from it, I use it to send the book out to other people to read. So I hope I appreciate you letting me get the word out, because there are so many misconceptions. And as long as those misconceptions prevail, it's going to really undermine our whole federal system in the United States of America and the unity of the United States of America.
Absolutely. And there's that kind of tension right now. And I'd like to have that eliminate, where people realize that they are so blessed. And as you know, you might disagree with your neighbor, but
we've been spoiled because we have elections, which most of the time give us a winner overnight. We're used to looking on TV the night before, and then the next day, okay, election's over, we can proceed. Yeah. But if we had, here's one other thing. If we actually had the Russian system, the popular vote system, just take one election here, 1960, the so-called hypothetical popular vote was so narrow that they said that we would have to have a recount in every state. Now, in 2000, you saw the trauma the country went through having recounts in one state. Multiply that by a factor of 50, and you would get some idea of the trauma the country would have been put through in 1960 if we did not have an electoral college. Yes, the popular vote was tight, but the Electoral College was overwhelming in favor of John Kennedy, and no one batted an eye. No one thought anything of it. And that's what happens most of the time with the Electoral College. Once in a while, once or twice a century, you have the hypothetical popular vote not jiving with the electoral vote. That's very rare. It's happened in England. If you look at the number of people who voted for their members of parliament, and you look at the total votes and compare it to the number of people they elected, that doesn't always jibe. But no one says, let's abolish parliament. Let's adopt the Russian system, so-called popular vote system. No.
Yeah. And if with all the talk now with what's going on in Russia, I'm sure people are not like, let's do Russia's system.
Well, people are. They don't realize it. That's the problem. They don't realize that they are proposing the Russian system. And the French have adopted it to their chagrin and the outrage of the people of that country.
We've seen that. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'm so grateful. Thank you so much, Professor Hardaway, for coming today to Forbidden Speech, The Raw Truth. Thank you. Have a great day.
Bye-bye.